Hello students, I'm Professor Plinio Monteiro, and in this video I will explain what are Incoterms, basically the terms of sales and delivery for international trade. Incoterms refers to international commercial terms that are international setting standards definitions that you can use for a contract, and these terms are accepted by the International Chamber of Commerce. So once you use some of these international commercial terms in your agreements and your contracts, basically it will be much more clear for you and for the buyer what are the terms of the sale and the delivery of the products that you're selling. And basically, using that, you can have more confidence on what you're really trying to deliver to the customer, and also what are the responsibility of the customers in this transaction. So let's see what are the most common international commercial terms. Nowadays, exist 11 different Incoterms that you can use in an international trade contract. Let me explain each of these, telling you how can you apply them in different types of contracts. Ex-works represents one way of making your agreement of sales with little responsibility from the seller. Basically, ex-works means that all the responsibility for delivering, for transportation, and insurance, and so on, all of these will be under the responsibility of the buyer. So basically, in that case, the price that you put in the contract represents the price usually in a factory or warehouse, mine, or so on. And all charges, taxes, and costs for distributing and the logistics of this product will be under the responsibility of the buyer. You can use that in any way of transportation, for using sea, land, or even air. In the free carrier, the buyer will assume most of the responsibilities in this transaction. In that case, the buyer will receive from the seller the product in a named place, and after that, the buyer needs to take care of the insurance, the taxes, all the documentation for delivering the product from home country to the host country, or from home market to the foreign market. Carriage paid to is basically a way to make a trade where the seller will be responsible for paying the transport and the logistics, but they will not be responsible for ensuring, or they will not have no responsibility by the goods that are being sold. In that case, basically the seller will arrange the logistics and arrange and pay for it, but the seller will be not responsible anymore for the goods being sold. In that case, the carrier, since the carrier received the product, the responsibility for that is between the carrier and the buyer. In carriage and insurance paid to, basically the seller will be responsible for paying the transport and also the insurance of the goods sold. But besides that, since the seller delivered the product to the carrier, then he will not be responsible anymore. But of course, he will be responsible for paying and making the insurance of the goods until the buyer receives it in a named place. Delivered at place unloaded. This term was known as delivered at terminal in Incoterms 2010. And what means this approach? Basically, in this case, the seller will be responsible for paying the transport, for insurance, and also be the responsible for the carriage until the buyer receives the product in a named place. And only the risk will be transferred from the seller to the buyer only when the goods are unloaded in that named place. So this means that only after the seller unloads the products, then the buyer will be responsible for will have the responsibility to take care of the products. A similar approach is named delivered at place. What's the main difference from the last one is that basically since the products arrive at a named place, then the responsibility for unload the product it will be under the buyer. So the risk to have something crashed during this unloading will be under the responsibility of the buyer. So in that case, the buyer is responsible for unloading the products. In free alongside ship, basically the seller will be responsible for delivering the product unto a port, usually an ocean to be loaded in an ocean vessel. And at this point, the responsibility for loading the products in the vessel or putting that and all the risks during the transportation will be under the responsibility of the buyer. And in that case, the buyer needs to pay for loading the goods and all the other activities until the buyer receives the products. Free on board is another approach very similar to the last one. In that case, the main difference is that the seller will be responsible for loading the products in the vessel. And that can be on ocean, on the sea, or inland. And in that case, once the products are loaded in the vessel, then the responsibility will be under the buyer. So the buyer needs to pay for insurance, the transports, and so on. Cost and free is another alternative that is similar to the last one. The main difference is that now the seller is responsible for paying for the logistics, paying for the transport. In that case, the seller will deliver the product in a place and then will load the product in a vessel, and then the payment for this transportation will be under responsibility of the seller, but not insurance. The insurance of these products will be under responsibility of the buyer. In that case, since the seller delivered the product in in the carrier or in the sport dock, the responsibility will be the buyer will be responsible for the product. This approach, similar to the last one, adds the insurance as one responsibility of the seller, but beside that, it's basically the same thing. So the seller will deliver the products in the docks, and there the products will be loaded in the vessels, and the buyer will be responsible for the products since then, but the payment for the transports and the insurance will be under the responsibility of the seller. Delivery duty paid is another approach, also known as the approach with the maximum obligations from the part of the seller. So the seller will be responsible for the products, for arranging the logistics, all the documentation, for paying transports, for paying for the insurance, and also paying the duties and fees in the foreign markets. And just after all of these, then the buyer will receive the product without any obligations, just the transportation in the foreign market. In that case, this approach is the one where the seller will have most responsibilities for doing this sale. This table represents a summary between the risk transferences between buyer and the seller using different Incoterms. And for example, in the X works, we have the transference from the seller to the buyer during inside the supplier's factory or warehouse. In that case, the main transit risk is under the responsibility of the buyer. In the case of the free alongside ship, we have the transference risk at the dock at port of shipment, usually a sport dock. And in that place, the risk will be transferred from the seller to the buyer. On the free on board, we have the transference of risk to the buyer in the port of shipment, usually the board vessel. In that case, after the products are loaded in the vessel, then the responsibility for the products will be, the buyer will be responsible for that. In the cost and freight, we have the same. So basically, since the products are loaded in the vessel, the buyer will be responsible. In the case of the cost, insurance, and freight, then the responsibility can be sometimes transferred to the seller. It can be under the responsibility of seller until the port of shipment or in the port of destination, depending on the agreement. In the case of the delivered at terminal or delivered at place unloaded, basically the responsibility will be transferred to the seller, to the buyer in the port of destination. And the main difference between these two is that in the delivery at place, basically the seller will not be responsible for unloading the products. And in the case of delivered at place unloaded, so basically the seller will still need to unload the products to transfer the responsibility to the buyer. And finally, the last one, in delivery dot paid, in that case, the transference of responsibility will only achieve the buyer in the buyer's warehouse, in really the destination. So the main responsibility, the main risk of our transport and process will be under the responsibility of the seller. Also, you need to establish the terms of payment in an international transaction. And we have many different approaches for choosing these terms of payment, and some of them will represent higher risks in the seller perspective and others low risk in the seller's perspective. And also, the low risk approach is usually recommended when the seller cannot trust in the buyer. And in the other hand, the high risk approach you can use when you really trust in the buyer. In the other perspective, if you look to the buyer, at the same way that some approaches present a lot of risks for the seller, then this approach will present a lot of advantages for the buyer. And so the approaches that are present low level of risk from the seller's perspective will be the ones that present less advantages for the buyer. So let's look to these different approaches and see how you can use them when you make an international transaction. So in cash in advance, basically the seller will receive the payment before they ship the products. In that case, you have a very low risk in the seller's perspective, but of course, the buyer will be something not so you present not a lot of advantages for the buyer. In the confirmed letter of credit, basically the buyer will go to the bank and send a letter telling that since the seller delivered the product to the buyer, then the seller can go to the bank and receive the payment. In the case of the confirmed letter of credit, is basically when the bank confirms that the buyer has the money to pay for this transaction. And the main difference from the letter of credit is that in this letter of credit here, the bank will not confirm that the buyer has the money to pay before the seller sends the products to the buyer. The documents against payment is basically when the seller sent a documentation. The buyer sent the documentation to the seller, and since all the documents are okay, then the buyer will make the payment. So basically, if the seller delivers the product to the buyer, and if everything's okay, then since the seller delivered the documents to the buyer, then the buyer will have this responsibility to pay the seller. In that case, you have like an average between the advantage from the perspective of the buyer and the risk in the point of view of the seller. The document against acceptance, basically in that case, the buyer still needs to accept documents and other products. And because of that, the seller will have more risks, because sometimes the buyer cannot accept the document and say, okay, something is missing, and then the seller will not receive the payment. And because of that, you have this approach, you have more advantages in the perspective of the buyer, and it's a very high risk approach for accepting payment. An open account, it's a standard approach. Basically, the seller will send the products and you send the invoice, and since the buyer received that, then you're going to ask for the payment. So you're going to send the documentation for payment, but just this will be just one open account in the seller's perspective. And since the seller delivers the products to the buyer, then the buyer and the seller need to have another interaction to receive the payment. And finally, we have the consignment. And in that case, basically the seller will give the products to the buyer and will receive no payment until the buyer sells the products. In that case, basically, it's the approach with a lot of risks from the seller's perspective, and you have a lot of advantages in the perspective of buyer. Sometimes companies trying to enter into foreign markets, for instance, in supermarkets, it's common to sell products to big retailers worldwide, and then at least in the first transaction, this transaction will be under a consignment, for instance. Basically, the seller will give the products to the buyers, and if the retailers sell the products, if they achieve a good performance, then sometimes they can pay for this first buy, or even they can receive that for free and start having payments in the second sales in the next transactions with the same seller. In this video, I explained how you can use different income terms to define the way that you're going to make the delivery and the transaction with the buyer, and also explained the payment terms that you can use in this kind of contract. This is it for this video. See you in the next. Bye.